I'm Sloane, 45 on my birthday. My mother told me I was too poor to belong and shut the door. 2 weeks later, the bank's auction clock hit 0, and the deed to their house printed with my name. Tonight I'm returning not for revenge, but to tell them their new landlord is the daughter they threw away. The sky over Maple Street wore that thin, metallic gray that makes everything look like a receipt you can't argue with. I parked beneath the magnolia my mother planted for appearances and smoothed the carefully mended navy dress I'd hemmed at 2 in the morning. In my other hand, I balanced a homemade lemon cake under a plastic dome, still smelling faintly of zest and hope. I told myself this would be simple. Dinner. Candles. Civility. Opening the door without knocking felt like an act of loyalty they didn't deserve, but old habits walk in before you do. Diane's foyer was the same curated shabby chic she copied from magazines: distressed console, bowl of faux, keys, art that pretends to be inherited. She eyed my dress the way a jeweler eyes a counterfeit stone. Vintage, she said, lips dipping into a smile that tasted like vinegar. Bianca floated in with a phone on a ring light, sing-songing that my look was vintage, like unplanned, and tapped the screen as if she were stamping my return label. I carried the cake to the dining room as if I were smuggling optimism. Aunt Corinne adjusted a napkin and murmured, not quite under her breath, that at my age a woman ought to have a husband and a cushion. I swallowed the retort and placed the cake beside the store-bought tiramisu she preferred for branding. Opal, my grandmother, trailed a fingertip along the rim of a crystal glass, soft as moth wings, and said, "Appearances help people feel safe." She didn't meet my eyes. Safety, in this house, had always meant silence. Tonight I tried another approach. Honesty. "I've been freelancing since the layoff," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "The way you handle a pan with a loose handle. Retainers are in the works. It's lean for now." The word lean rubbed the room the wrong way. Diane straightened the cutlery as if realigning a life. Bianca tilted her phone and asked if I was in a rebrand arc. Corinne clicked her tongue about stability like she was clicking a seatbelt. Opal folded her napkin into a smaller square and mentioned that image matters in this neighborhood, as though the zip code could file a complaint. Cousin Nadia arrived late, perfume first, contrition never, and pretended to whisper while angling her camera for a covert clip. "Content," she breathed to someone on the other end. "Because nothing in our family exists until it's performed." I cut into the lemon cake, the glaze catching chandelier light like a compromise. Diane raised a hand. "We're not doing desserts from store-brand flour," she said. Each word buffed to a judgmental shine. Laughter, polite and brittle, skipped around the table. I felt my ribs count themselves. In that counting, I remembered rent, a grace period, a deadline. I mentioned the rent extension I'd requested and watched the room recoil the way people do from a dog that only wants water. Diane dabbed at an invisible spill. "We can't be weighed down by your situation," she said, as if misfortune were a carry-on I refused to gate-check. She pointed to the attic, to the handful of boxes I'd stored there when the lease on my last apartment ended. "The neighbors notice. It's not the look we want." The neighbors had never once learned my name, but my boxes, apparently, had starring roles. "A husband and a cushion," Corinne repeated, swirling her wine as though she'd discovered gravity. Bianca asked why I hadn't just manifested a better job, which is how people with nets explain trapezes. Opal murmured that image keeps doors open. "Whose doors?" I asked, surprising myself with the steadiness of my tone. "The ones that close if I wear mended seams?" The silence felt like the hush before a verdict. Diane's eyes skimmed me with a meticulousness she usually reserves for baseboards. "Sloane," she said, voice cooled to a hotel lobby. "We can't keep pretending you're one of us." Told to clear my boxes tonight, I spotted a foreclosure notice beneath Azalea. Rain stitched crooked lines across the windshield as I crammed soggy boxes into my hatchback and watched ink bleed through the cardboard like veins losing their way. Birthday candles still in my pocket. I wedged the last carton of books beside a laundry basket of mismatched hangers. then slammed the trunk and listened to the latch decide whether it believed in me. Midnight felt less like a time and more like a verdict. The driveway lights flicked off behind me, the house sealing itself as if I were weather to keep out. I started the engine, heater coughing, and told myself I would remember this exact cold. My phone lit with a message from Giselle, my landlord, as clinical as a billing code. Rent by Friday or keys back Saturday. No emojis, no padding, a thin line I could trip over. I stared at the screen until the text blurred, then snapped a photo of the foreclosure notice I had rescued from the azalea pot, the bank's stamp smeared but legible enough to confirm what pride had hidden. Months behind. My mother's house looked invincible from the curb, all tasteful shutters and curated planters, but numbers strip paint faster than weather. If they had exiled me for looking poor, the house itself was about to be auditioned for the role. I called Priya because courage sounds better in a voice you trust. She picked up on the first ring and told me to come over, no lecture, just the practical mercy of a friend who owns exactly one spare blanket and half a living room. 2 nights. Max. She warned. Not because love expires, but because her landlord watches hallway cameras like a hobby. I promised. I would be gone before her Sunday morning yoga class and meant it. On her stoop, she pressed a mug into my hands, then sat with me at the tiny table and helped turn panic into bullet points. We wrote a no-frills 30-day survival and bounce-back plan that smelled of ink and resolve. Before we slept, I photographed everything I could sell and made a ruthless list. The old DSLR camera from my agency days, marketing textbooks with fluorescent flags, a scuffed tablet, shoes I only wore to interviews, and, after a long pause, the bracelet my grandmother gave me when I turned 21. I didn't want to part with that small circle of memory, but sentiment doesn't pay deposits. Priya staged items on a clean towel, angled a lamp for soft light, and typed captions trimmed of apology. We cross-posted to marketplaces we could find, and I watched strangers ask for dimensions like they were measuring my past. Each ping felt like a door I hadn't noticed opening quietly. Resolve hardened into architecture. I drew a ladder on scrap paper and labeled the rungs with ink that wouldn't smudge. Stabilize cash flow, line up capital, watch Maple Street like a hawk. Stabilize meant saying yes to grim, unglamorous gigs, overnight copy edits, social calendars no one reads, ad sets for brands that spell disruption with too many consonants. Capital meant research that doesn't blink. Distressed property forums, bank auctions, tax lien sales, any legal corner where neglected houses change hands quickly. Watching Maple Street meant studying every public record I could, from mortgage assignments to code violations, following the breadcrumbs of math. The promise I made in Priya's kitchen was simple enough to carve into a doorframe: own what they worship. I set calendar alerts like tripwires, bank auction Maple Street 14 days, plus reminders for 7, 3, and 1. I built a spreadsheet with cells the color of traffic lights and fed it with retainer proposals, invoice, due dates, gas estimates, and the thin margin for groceries that wouldn't sabotage my focus. At 2 a.m., while Priya snored from the couch with her feet under my donated coat, I refreshed a county docket and read forum threads written by people who sounded like scavengers and saints. Somewhere between caution and hunger, I found the heat I needed, a coal that glowed whenever I pictured Diane's dining room or Bianca's smooth camera angles. Then a late-night email pinged from a loan officer named Quinn. We might have options. My laptop balanced on Priya's wobbly coffee table when the video window opened to Quinn. Cropped hair, clear glasses, posture like a metronome. She skipped pleasantries and asked for numbers, not narratives, which suited the new version of me that had stopped auditioning for approval. I gave her the layoff, the rent deadline, the bank auction date, and the Target address with its pious shutters. She typed, nodded once, and said she could help if I accepted. Sharp edges. The way she said help felt contractual, which, frankly, was the only kind I could trust. We started with my credit. A landscape of frost and stubborn shoots. Quinn circled the late payment I already hated and the medical bill that kept resurrecting like a party crasher. Income came next. Retainer proposals, trial scopes, rush jobs, the thin river of deposits proving I wasn't drowning yet. I showed her my color-coded spreadsheet. She asked how many hours I could work before quality fell apart. Enough, I said, meaning the distance you swim because there isn't another shore. She believed me the way bankers do, only after the math nodded. Then she explained hard money with surgical calm. Expensive interest, short terms, fees with teeth, inspections that care about collateral, not character. Speed is the product, she said. The numbers pencil and your exit is credible, the bridge holds. I felt my old urge to please scrape against the plan and let it go. Bridges don't apologize for being narrow. She made me budget reserves for taxes, insurance, repairs, and vacancy because every dream charges upkeep. And lenders dislike surprises even more than borrowers do. I rebuilt my cash flow model from zero while Priya brewed tea strong enough to stand up by itself. I listed gigs I could accept without breaking and sorted expenses into friendlier names: food, gas, storage, phone, software, incidentals, so I wouldn't resent them. Worst case, likely case, stretch case. The cells steadied, turning from alarm to instruction. The plan didn't care that I had been humiliated, that indifference made it trustworthy. Numbers are rude little truth-tellers, and once they line up, they march forward, whether or not you're ready. Priya helped me polish 3 retainer pitches until they clicked like seatbelts. We trimmed adjectives, sharpened deliverables, and priced for survival, not theater. By afternoon, one prospect agreed to a 30-day trial, and the other 2 scheduled discovery calls. I printed the thread and slid it into a folder labeled future-proof, because sometimes you need paper to steady your breathing while a banking app spins. Momentum, thin but present, made the room feel larger than the studio's square footage. The hours themselves bruised in quiet ways. I woke at 5 for copy edits, wrangled social calendars at noon between haggles over the camera listing, and launched ad sets after midnight while a neighbor practiced saxophone scales like a conscience. I ate toast over the sink and reminded myself that focus often masquerades as hunger when you stop performing for people who enjoy you diminished. By Thursday, my eyes burned, but invoices had gone out, micro deposits came in, and I had moved my boxes into a cheaper storage unit, measured in relief per step. On breaks, I binged county records and auction comps until the database felt like small-town gossip. Similar square footage, similar age, better roofs here, worse kitchens, there. Maple Street's after-repair value looked strong if the fixes stayed cosmetic. Discipline, not drama, would be my edge. I practiced a poker face in the mirror, calm, mildly bored, impossible to bait, and folded my walk-away number into my wallet like a promise. Then I called Sloane for a drive-by read based on public photos and the angles Nadia had once flaunted online. Sloane, practical as a level, guessed roof issues, paint, 2 faucets, and a water heater that might sulk. Nothing fatal, just expensive if ignored. I sank her ranges into the sheet and trimmed my bid. By Friday, Quinn sent a pre-approval letter that read like a dare wrapped in bureaucracy. I stepped for air. My phone lit up with a text from Diane. Not concerned, just, did I take her cake tray? By Saturday morning, the promise I had carved into Priya's kitchen table sharpened into a plan. If they wouldn't let me sit at their table, I would buy the table, the room, and the deed nailed to the studs. Deciding. To bid on the very house that tossed me into the rain didn't feel vindictive. It felt like arithmetic, the clean kind that balances no matter who's watching. I printed the auction packet, circled the parcel number, and said the address out loud until the syllables lost their power to bruise. Then I called Yara, the paralegal Priya swore was equal parts compass and cliff edge, and asked her to walk me through the law the way you'd walk someone along a ledge in the dark. Yara met me at a downtown coffee shop where lattes cost courage and the tables rattled with case talk. She scanned the foreclosure docket on her tablet and sketched the chain of title like a family tree that had caught a fever. We parsed liens, a small HOA balance, and a delinquent utilities tag that could surface like a shark if ignored. Occupancy is the hinge, she said, tapping the screen. If they're still inside after the sale, you'll need either a negotiated exit or a lawful process. Tact buys time. Paper buys protection. I swallowed the metallic taste of that word they, and wrote it anyway, because the court wouldn't care that the pronoun bent like a boomerang. She handed me a checklist that read like a steady heartbeat. Verify lien priority. Confirm redemption windows. Budget for lock change with proper notice. Never self-help. Keep correspondence unemotional. You're buying a problem, she added, not unkindly, and transforming it into an asset is the work. I nodded, thinking of lemon glaze under chandelier light. Serve a cake no one would taste because image doesn't allow homemade. If the process required diplomacy, I could do that. I had learned to set a table while starving. At home, I rehearsed a calm script in the mirror for the moment my relatives might realize I was the bidder. The speech was simple. I'm acting as an investor, not a daughter. I will follow the law and offer options. I will not negotiate over text threads that treat me like an intruder. I practiced keeping my gaze steady and my voice low, the verbal equivalent of a level line. Then my phone flashed with Nadia's latest story, a filtered slow pan of the dining room and the caption, "Some people just don't fit in." The timing sliced, then sealed. I muted her and felt the furnace in my chest click on. Discipline demanded numbers, not nerves. I mapped a maximum bid and a walkaway figure on a yellow pad and copied both into my spreadsheet, locking the cells so I couldn't accidentally nudge them in a heated minute. Emotion would not drive the paddle. I built in Celine's estimate for roof patching, exterior paint, 2 cranky faucets, and a water heater with a personality. Manageable, not cheap, she had said, and I preferred hard honesty to polite optimism. I folded contingencies for taxes, insurance, and 3 months of vacancy. If everything went right, the surplus would be tidy. If everything hiccuped, it would be tight but survivable. Noor, who ran a scrappy storage co-op like a benevolent pirate, gave me a unit the size of a generous closet with a discount and a wink. I stacked my boxes in a neat column and labeled them with fat marker, the way you give future you small favors. Each tote I lifted felt like I was hoisting a rung on the ladder I'd sketched. Stabilize cash flow, line up capital, watch Maple Street like a hawk. When the door clanged shut, the echo sounded like a period instead of an ellipsis. Open previews were announced for bidders to observe exterior condition, which is code for stand on the sidewalk and make inferences. I showed up in a cap and mask, my hair tucked, my expression set to uninterested neighbor. A pair of investors whispered near the curb, speculating about comps and unknown occupants. I stared at the gutters, the fascia, the way water had drawn faint tiger stripes on the siding, and cataloged risk with the coolness of an appraiser. If anyone looked too long at me, I checked my phone like the weather bored me. Back at Priya's, I set up the auction account and wired earnest funds through trembling fingers. The platform's confirmation chime landed like a gavel in a small courtroom only I could hear. I printed the receipt and slid it into Yara's checklist, then texted Quinn a photo of the wire with the caption, "In." Quinn replied with a thumbs up and a line about keeping powder dry, which made me smile because nothing about my life felt powdery or dry. It felt electrical, like standing beneath a storm I wasn't afraid of anymore. I washed the mug I'd been using like a talisman, set it on the rack, and refreshed the auction page one more time out of superstition. The email arrived as the apartment settled into its nighttime hum, subject line blunt as a door shutting. Foreclosure auction moved up 48 hours. Pooled light from Priya's kitchen pendant turned the laminate into a small stage, while I sat with the laptop open, heartbeat loud, at the edges of my focus. The auction portal refreshed in burst login verified, deposit confirmed, property page live, and bidder handles bloomed like storm cells on a radar. I told myself to breathe evenly, let adrenaline skim the surface, remember that math, not indignation, would be my anchor. 2 familiar investor aliases muscled to the top, names I recognized from forums where they bragged about cap rates and timing. I watched their patterns like a dealer watches hands, tiny hesitations before odd increments, jumps after round numbers, a lull whenever competing bids landed on sevens. Every twitch suggested appetite and caution braided together. When the countdown rolled under 5 minutes, I placed the first bid. A measured offer within my ceilings and exit strategy. My breath snagged. I set auto increments inside my limits so my heart wouldn't negotiate against me in the scrum, then switched to the spreadsheet I printed. Roof patching, paint, faucets, carry costs, closing, fees. Each line item stood like a guardrail I wouldn't hop. A surprise latecomer surged with a username that sounded like a shell company and a velocity that felt personal. The numbers leapt in reckless intervals as if someone were bidding with caffeine and a grudge. I refused the temptation to chase, refusing to look back when a door slams behind you. Let them test the ceiling. I would not be the one to paint it. My phone buzzed with a message from Quinn that cut through the static like a straight edge. Stay disciplined. Walk away if it breaks the math. No fireworks, no pep talk, just policy. I imagined her posture, exact and unbothered, and let the words settle my pulse. Numbers do not care that I was humiliated, only whether the exit cash flows and the debt can be serviced without breath holding. The price wobbled near my cap and hovered as if considering me specifically. I waited, counting a slow 8 the way Yara had taught me for awkward silences, then entered a final, surgical bid positioned $1 above the cadence the two primary investors had favored. No flourish, no flex. Just a precise incision where impulse usually lives. If it landed wrong, I would walk. If it landed right, the math would hold. Silence blew across the screen like a gust that clears smoke. One investor blinked tiny pause, then nothing and the other went still in a way that felt like a person remembering their own rules. The countdown ticked down like a drumbeat in a high school gym. 10, 9, 8. The room shrinking with each beat until it was just me, a cursor, and the thinnest thread of breath I refused to lose. Sold splashed across the page in block letters so definitive they felt carved. For a second I froze, not from doubt but from the sudden absence of fight, like when the rain stops and the roof keeps talking. My name appeared on the provisional certificate, stark and bureaucratic and perfect. Priya's scream ricocheted off the cabinets, and my own hands began to shake as if they had stored electricity for this exact moment. I paced the narrow kitchen in a small figure 8, nauseous and euphoric, while Priya slid a glass of water toward me like I might refuse it on principle. The spreadsheet waited calmly on the table, proof that this wasn't a dramatic monologue but a transaction with witnesses. Somewhere in the building, someone practiced a cheerful scale on a trumpet, and it sounded, for once, like possibility instead of noise. Then the realization slid into place with the weight of a filing cabinet. The paperwork would expose me to my family soon enough. Deeds, notices, change of mailing addresses, utility transfers, none of it wore disguises. I steadied myself against the counter and reminded my lungs how to work. I had chosen this. I had earned this. I could handle the fallout so long as the math continued to bless the plan. Diane called, her voice brittle. The bank just said something about new ownership. Is this a joke? Sloane, right now then? Yara drafted the notice like a scalpel, not a sword, and made me read every line until the language felt cool to the touch. We filed it by the book certificate of mailing, copy to the trustee, delivery receipt tucked behind a paperclip because I didn't want my first act as an owner to be a scene from our family theater. Be lawful, be humane, be firm, I wrote at the top of my notebook, and underlined each word until the ink sank into the cardboard backing. Owning the house didn't mean I owned my dignity. That would take choices measured in inches, not applause. Diane called before the envelope even cooled, her voice sugared at the edges like a cocktail rim. She wanted to talk mother to daughter, to remember the magnolia we planted, to remind me of the years she invested in my piano lessons. When charm slid off, guilt stepped in wearing the same shoes. You wouldn't do this to your mother, she said, as if love were a checkout coupon. I kept my tone at room temperature and told her what the notice already said. There were options, and I would honor whichever one they chose within the timelines the law required. Bianca bypassed conversation and went straight to spectacle, firing off a message threatening to tell the story to her followers if I didn't back down. I pictured the ring light, the curated backdrop, the half-truth caption that would gather sympathy in neat, heart-shaped piles. I resisted the reflex to defend myself and replied with a 2-sentence boundary. I won't discuss this on social media, and any false claims will be addressed through counsel. Opal, dear and brittle, called next, asking for discretion like it was a quilt we could wrap around the mess. I promised discretion. I did not promise surrender. With Yara's outline, I presented options as cleanly as a menu: cash for keys with a generous stipend tied to an agreed move-out date, a short transition timeline that included help securing a blonde of mind, comparable rental, or a new lease at fair market with professional management, inspections, and boundaries that didn't bend to family folklore. I spoke slowly, not like a teacher correcting, but like a contractor walking through a plan set. The words business and mercy can share a table if you said it carefully. I offered first month at an apartment complex Aisha recommended and a moving crew for 4 hours. In writing, countersigned, tracked. Nadia accused me of exploitation in a thread she half redacted but fully intended me to see. I refused to step onto the digital stage and instead sent her a copy of the agreement with the sections highlighted that protected them from late fees, surprise showings, and any pressure tactics. No revenge, just business, I typed. And let the period be a door. That night, Celine did an exterior walk-by, texting me photos of gutters, hairline cracks in paint, a downspout that sulked away from the foundation. No entry without notice, I reminded myself, and scheduled the first proper visit for when we were either signing a lease or handing over keys. Priya tried to drag me out to celebrate, but triumph felt too loud for the kind of victory I was after. We settled on a quiet tea at her window, while laundry machines downstairs breathed like sleeping dogs. I told her I felt like I was holding a violin by the neck, responsible for every note I drew from it. She nodded, then made me list 3 non-negotiables on a sticky note: compassion without self-erasure, process over performance, and no decisions after midnight. I stuck it to my laptop where my gaze lands when panic arrives in a glittering dress. The administrative chores became square stones I laid into a path. I filed insurance, set the effective date, and transferred utilities, water, electric, trash, internet enduring hold music that sounded like denial with a beat. I opened a separate maintenance reserve so I couldn't lie to myself later. When the last confirmation pinged, the house felt undeniably mine, on record and beyond argument. Then Greta, the neighbor, DM'd at dusk. "You should see what they're doing inside the house tonight." "Right now, Sloane?" I rolled past the house with my hazards on and parked where the curb nudges the public sidewalk, camera ready the way Yara trained me. Wide shot, medium, detail, timestamp. Heaped trash bags slumped beside the garage like overfed shadows, and a cracked planter hemorrhaged potting soil into a muddy crescent. The left gutter had chewed a dark stripe down the fascia. The porch light flickered with the stubborn rhythm of a secret. I kept my distance, documenting without drama, a witness rather than a daughter. Owning the deed felt abstract from this angle, but the responsibility was not. It tightened my focus until every nailhead looked like a decimal point. Greta's message hit like a smoke alarm, a shaky clip of Bianca yanking a cabinet door until the hinge sighed and split, while Nadia's laugh rang, bright and practiced from behind the camera. There was no tantrum in the frame, only choreography. They had moved a stack of plates out of harm's way, as if to prove this wasn't chaos but curation. My chest burned, not with rage, but with the arithmetic of loss. I saved the file to a folder labeled Evidence, noted the timestamp, and rang Yara. Then I called the police non-emergency line to log a property damage report. Calm, factual, and utterly boring on purpose. The dispatcher's voice was oatmeal plain. She issued a case number, reminded me to keep my distance, and wished me luck with the weary kindness of someone who has heard every kind of family. I wrote the number on the back of my hand and emailed Yara a preservation notice to send formally. Intentional damage reduces or voids cash for keys incentives. Further incidents will be documented and reflected in any settlement. All communication will stay in writing. I added stills from Greta's clip and a summary free of adjectives. When I hit send, the action felt clean, not vindictive, like sweeping shards into a dustpan before anyone pretends they're confetti. Opal called soon after, voice thin as tracing paper. She said she could not control Bianca or Nadia, that the moods in the house moved like weather, that she was sorry for what I had seen and sorrier for what I might. I pictured her small hands folded on the kitchen table, pressing patience into grain, and told her I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was protecting an asset I had paid for with money and years of oxygen. Then I adjusted the offer in writing. Repair costs would be deducted, the timeline shortened to limit further creative expression, and the door to a fair lease remained open if they preferred structure to exit. Celine reviewed the new images and sent a revised estimate. The splintered cabinet face needed replacement, not glue. Baseboards could be cleaned and repainted. A long scrape in the oak might stand out. The porch light likely required a new fixture rather than another prayer. I plugged her ranges into the sheet and recalibrated the numbers until the margins behaved. Then I installed small exterior cameras facing only public areas, posted a notice by the mailbox, logged serial numbers, and photographed their placement beside that day's newspaper. It wasn't paranoia, it was an invitation to better behavior through the promise of memory. Quinn called while I tightened the last bracket and told me, in her metronome voice, to keep every receipt, every timestamp, and every polite email. Judges like paper, she said, and paper likes order. I started a binder to mirror the digital folder, tabbed by date, because redundancy is a kindness to the future. When Diane finally confronted me on the porch, she didn't ask for terms. She announced I would regret this power trip. I kept my answer even. The only thing I regretted was the rain that night and the way the porch light went out while I held my boxes. At dawn, my phone rattled across the nightstand. Opal whispered that Bianca had packed a bag before sunrise and vanished, taking the heirloom jewelry with her. Her voice shook like spoons in a drawer, and the line filled with the rustle of boxes, the sound of a house holding breath for news. Morning found me with the engine idling, heater whispering, phone set to record as I stepped through the slow choreography Yara drilled into me. Inventory first, outrage never. Wide shots of every room from thresholds, close-ups of drawers, shelves, sockets, and sills, each frame stamped with time and patience. Missing: the brass cake stand, 2 blue porcelain bowls, the quilt Opal stitched during my finals week, and the pearled bracelet I already suspected Bianca had lifted. Damaged: a cabinet face with a fresh bruise, baseboard gouges along the hallway, and a ceiling stain that looked like a held breath. I logged every item methodically, hands steady, voice level, promising myself I would grieve later, spreadsheet now. Outside, the magnolia dropped leaves like verdicts, tapping the hood with soft, relentless fingers. I let the car idle and listened to the ticking engine while Diane's sentence replayed. Thin and expensive. We can't pretend you're one of us. I tasted the memory like lemon pith, bitter and bright, and watched the front window where we'd once taped paper snowflakes for a photo Opal swore she'd frame. The house did remember. Every chair scrape, every whispered appraisal, every judgment that arrived dressed as advice clung to the corners like dust that never quite lifts. The point wasn't to punish. The point was to stop practicing smallness. Humiliation had been their currency. Today mine would be documentation, deadlines, and signatures that didn't smudge. Decision made, I drafted a firm settlement. Pay damages itemized by Celine's estimate, or accept a reduced cash for keys today. Funds available upon verification and a professional walkthrough. The email was short, dry, and unarguable, the tone I'd spent years learning to fake at my old agency before I remembered it could serve me better in my own life. No more pleading, no theatrical paragraphs, only terms and a deadline. I CC'd Yara and breathed through 5 counts like Kiana's guide suggested. Even though I hadn't met Kiana yet, I was rehearsing the calm. Noor, who had built a small empire out of kindness and metal roll-up doors, connected me to Kiana, a mediator whose calendar was littered with the fallout of families like ours. Kiana's voice carried steadiness the way some people carry perfume. You noticed it before the words. We met in a conference room with a too-cold thermostat and a soft box of tissues that seemed to apologize for sitting there. I laid out facts, timestamps, offers, and the preservation notice. Kiana reminded everyone that today wasn't a courtroom, it was a bridge, and you don't sprint across something that's still being built. Bianca refused to appear, which was both predictable and strategically loud. Nadia arrived late with camera-ready eyeliner and shrugged off the process as content, the word stretched until it snapped. Diane sat across from me in coral lipstick, playing attentive while her foot jittered under the table like a lie trying to escape. Opal placed her purse on her lap and folded her hands around it, as if quiet could keep anything safe. I stayed with the facts: dates, screenshots, estimates, and my 3 options printed in 12-point font. When emotion prowled the edge of my tongue, I let it leave. Halfway through, Opal slid a faded photo from her wallet and set it near the center of the table like a match that wouldn't burn. I recognized the flour-smudged child immediately. 6 years old, hair in crooked pigtails, grinning at a lopsided cake I'd insisted on frosting myself. For a second, the room softened, cushions added to the chairs, corners rounded. The softness, it didn't change the math, but it made breathing easier. Respect first, then mercy, I reminded myself, and asked Diane to initial each page. Kiana's pen traveled back and forth with the patience of a fairy. At last, Kiana drafted a tight agreement: move out in 10 days, damages deducted per Celine's line items, keys exchanged at noon with a locksmith, and a mutual pledge of no online harassment or implied smears. Diane signed with a flourish, Nadia muttered about narrative control, and Opal pressed initials like a blessing. I signed last, anchoring what had drifted too long. That night, a truck idled outside Early Movers. We met at noon sharp because agreements breathe better in daylight. Kiana arrived with her calm zipped into a navy blazer, and the locksmith waited in his van with a clipboard and an air of lawful patience. The moving truck out front belonged to Nadia. I could tell by the curated chaos, matching bins, ring light, and a trio of friends who laughed like they rehearsed being unbothered. She didn't look at me as she ferried boxes, performing detachment for an audience that included only herself. Diane hovered on the porch in coral lipstick and a glassy stare, while Opal sat on the glider, hands folded as if prayer might be a polite form of leverage. We reviewed the agreement one more time, then stepped over the threshold like diplomats entering contested ground. Celine joined us for the walkthrough, hair tucked under a cap, clipboard ready, phone set to timestamp every observation. We moved room to room, the air full of old lemon cleaner and new irritation, and she called out the fresh dings as if reading weather. A scrape on the hallway oak, a soft swell in the baseboard behind the shoe rack, and a thin water stain blooming under the kitchen sink. She opened the cabinet and pressed the P-trap gently. It wept an apologetic bead that confirmed her hunch about a loose connection. I took photos. Then photos of the photos with the days, the paper in frame, because Quinn's mantra about judges liking paper had become my liturgy. Nadia brushed past, muttering about angles. I refused the bait and wrote down numbers. We gathered in the dining room where the chandelier had always tried too hard. I counted out the adjusted cash for keys, crisp bills placed on the runner in neat stacks like little fences, the total reduced by Celine's documented repairs. Diane accepted the envelope with the stiffness of someone accepting a verdict she'll challenge to an empty room later. Bianca was still missing, a silence that felt like a staged absence, and no one said her name. Opal whispered thank you with a tremor that wasn't strategy. It was the sound of something old letting go. Diane signed the last receipt without meeting my eyes, as if acknowledging me would confirm the most inconvenient rumor. When the keys slid off the ring into my palm, the metal felt warm, like a creature deciding whether to trust me. Kiana nodded to the keys, the locksmith, who started his practiced ballet of cylinders and pins while I stood in the foyer counting breaths. I changed the alarm code, photographed the panel, and watched the new deadbolt seat with a satisfying click. Then I walked each room again, this time slower, and filled the quiet with measured shutters, closets, corners, window sashes, the back of the stove, the lip of the tub, the threshold where the tile meets wood. I narrated each shot in a level voice so any future I faced would hear the present clearly. Celine pivoted into action the way good crews do when timing matters. She texted a painter for a gap day slot, lined up a cabinet face replacement, scheduled a plumber who owed her a favor, and sent me a checklist that turned panic into chores. We triaged, stop the leak, patch the wall, swap the porch light, pull scuffed quarter round, sand the scrape, prime, paint, deep clean. She kept a separate line for anything pretty and optional, because pretty waits until functional sits down. I built a maintenance budget from the bones of my spreadsheet and moved the first deposit into the reserve so I couldn't lie to myself later. Priya left takeout on the porch like a good luck charm, texted a heart, then disappeared so the moment could belong to the house and me. I ate cross-legged on the bare living room floor, noodles in a paper container balanced on the inspection folder, and listened to the refrigerator hum like it was practicing a calmer future. The vents exhaled dust that smelled like attic stories, and I opened windows to let the day rinse the edges. The quiet wasn't forgiveness, it was inventory. Still, my shoulders dropped a notch I'd been carrying so long I had thought it was part of my skeleton. In my old bedroom, now mine by deed rather than tolerance, I stood where my childhood desk had once carved a rectangle into the carpet and felt the groove linger under the new paint smell. I didn't pretend the past was softer than it was. I didn't audition for their sympathy or drag out a monologue to prove anything to anyone. Instead, I let the knot loosen one coil, the way you let your grip ease on a rope when the boat finally finds the dock. A future lived on purpose felt possible here. If I kept my promises to the math and to myself. I pulled the blinds and opened my calendar. Camila, the stager Priya swore could conjure warmth without lying, could do a consult on Wednesday. Zara, the photographer who loves morning light, had a Friday slot that would make the listing look like certainty. Whether I kept the house or listed it after stabilizing, I wanted clean files, flattering angles, and a record of dignity. I drafted emails, attached measurements Celine had texted, and tucked fresh batteries into the thermostat display like a small, respectful ritual. On my way out to toss broken hangers, I found a letter slid beneath the door. Thick paper in a modest envelope stamped by a community housing nonprofit. They asked whether I'd consider renting to them long-term. Aisha arrived with a canvas tote and a notebook armored in color tabs, her handshake calm enough to make the kitchen breathe. She spoke for a nonprofit that placed women re-entering the workforce after pauses shaped by caregiving, layoffs, and luck that didn't go viral. We sat where arguments once auditioned as tradition, and she sketched their offer without sparkle. A master lease with guaranteed rent, case management woven into weekly check-ins, and house rules written for quiet living, no subletting, no revolving door guests, respect for neighbors, respect for space. The vocabulary was logistics, but beneath it I heard what I'd been building toward, stability that did not depend on a holiday smile. The rent was fair, not a headline. Longer terms meant fewer handoffs and less wear on the rooms. Guaranteed payments meant I could budget instead of brace. I asked about midnight calls, repairs, and what happened when a resident's progress stuttered. Aisha answered in policy, not wishful thinking. I showed her Celine's punch list. Receipts filed behind neat tabs, and the maintenance reserve I'd already opened. We're looking for landlords who treat fixes like oxygen, she said. I'm looking for tenants who treat walls like promises, I answered, surprised to hear how steady my own voice had become. That night, the spreadsheet made its usual unemotional case, sell after rehab and pocket a clean profit that would soothe critics and silence my landlord's texts into the distance. My chest made a different argument. Keep the property, stabilize it, and build a floor under my life that doesn't tremble when the news does. Quinn joined a late call and ran scenarios with the soft click of a metronome. Refinance after the work at a conservative valuation. Debt service coverage using nonprofit rent. Reserves padded enough that a grumbling water heater wouldn't own my sleep. The numbers penciled not, dazzling but decisively real. I wrote Aisha at dawn. Purpose with profit. I attached terms that guarded the edges. A shared maintenance portal so requests never evaporate. Inspection windows set on the calendar. Confidentiality for residents. And a clause about social media this home would not be content. She replied with a yes that felt like a door opening without a squeak. We scheduled inspection for Thursday. Celine, who believes dignity is measured in caulk lines, closed the last gaps, tightened the slow-weeping P-trap, swapped the sulking porch light, and left the place humming like a well-tuned vowel. Camila rethought her staging from listing gloss to durable welcome, replacing fragile vases with soft lamps, laying washable runners, and pulling the furniture a whisper apart so the rooms could breathe. Inspection day arrived without performance. Aisha and her facilities lead moved through the house with professional curiosity, testing smoke detectors, reading breaker labels, and peeking under sinks with small focused lights. When the P-trap held, Celine shot me a sideways grin. When the windows slid without complaint, Aisha scribbled a checkmark next to egress. We passed. Then signed no confetti. No speech, only the relief of seeing intentions harden into lines and initials. The lease would start in 3 weeks, with the first cohort arriving a week later. 3 women with fresh job placements and the kind of careful optimism that knows the cost of optimism. We set a cadence that felt like respect. Quarterly walkthroughs with notice. Weekly check-ins handled by the nonprofit. A standing Saturday morning window for repairs so no one had to rearrange shifts. A maintenance fund that skimmed from rent automatically before ambition could spend it. I laminated a 1-page map shutoffs, breaker index, contacts that didn't begin with me, and slid it into the hall closet beside a small toolkit labeled with a paint pen. Then I wrote a note on a card and kept moving it from room to room as if the house should decide where it belonged. This house will hold people up. I tucked it into the binder instead of the walls. Some promises work better off stage. On move-in eve, I built a welcome basket that looked like a pantry, not a photo shoot. Rice, beans, pasta, oatmeal, good olive oil, tea, coffee, and fresh lemons because the scent still means beginning to me. I added a can opener and measuring cups, small tools that keep a person from feeling defeated by dinner. Bus passes for the first week slid into an envelope, and I signed the card simply, Sloane, owner. I walked the rooms one last time, checking lamp switches and window latches, listening to the refrigerator settle into a steady hum that sounded like a low, practical hope. In the doorway I paused, not to pose, but to notice. The house did not flinch when I locked it. As I stepped off the porch, my phone buzzed with a message that reset the air between my lungs. Diane texted, "Your grandmother isn't well. She wants to see you at the house." Opal was already on the porch when I pulled up. A cardigan draped over her shoulders like a memory that refused to loosen. She reached for my hand, papery and strong at once, and I felt the small, stubborn heartbeat that had carried her through decades of appearances. The magnolia leaves whispered together above us, and for a moment we stood there as if the tree were translating. She studied my face the way she used to check a cake through the oven glass, not prying so much as hoping it had set. "You came," she said, and I heard more gratitude than surprise. "You asked," I answered, and let the screen door sigh open for us. Inside, the freshly painted living room held the afternoon like a bowl. Sun pooled over the new rugs Camila had chosen, warm without begging for attention, and the walls wore their soft color as if they'd always been that calm. Opal lowered herself to the edge of the sofa, smoothed her skirt, and took a steadying breath. "I failed you," she said, not hunting for a gentler synonym. That night, I told myself propriety needed guarding. Pride dressed up as manners. I thought I was keeping us respectable. Her words were small stones placed carefully between us. I sat opposite, hands folded, and let them land. Sometimes you don't rescue a confession, you give it a quiet place to sit. She asked what the nonprofit would do here, eyes bright with curiosity rather than inspection. So I explained in plain words. The master lease, guaranteed rent, case managers who actually show up, weekly check-ins that respect work schedules, house rules that treat quiet as a resource instead of a luxury. I told her I'd set a maintenance fund that skimmed automatically, that Celine had labeled shutoffs and breakers, that Saturday mornings were reserved for repairs so daily life wouldn't keep rearranging itself around our logistics. No revolving door, I said. No chaos, just rooms that help people remember themselves. Opal's tears brimmed without theatrical effort. They belonged to oxygen, not audience. "I'm proud of you," she said, the late truth carried by an old voice. "I thought success came dressed in one color. You found it in another, and it fits you better." I nodded, feeling the knot in my chest cinch and ease at once. Footsteps on the walkway broke the spell. Diane arrived with keys clutched too tightly, posture ironed, jaw set. We sat in a triangle of polite geometry, the air crowded with unsent emails and unswallowed words. Aisha's laminated one-pager lay on the coffee table, an anchor disguised as paper. "I need to be clear," I said, lifting the page like a flag without wind. "This house is a sanctuary now. Visits are by invitation, quiet is a rule, and no one uses these rooms to audition for sympathy. If that feels harsh, it's because I finally built a boundary that holds." Opal nodded once, solemn as a witness. Diane kept her gaze on a thread in the rug, twisting it as if truth could be coaxed out of cotton. I added the practicals: no surprise drop-ins, no photos for posts, no passive-aggressive deliveries left at the door. "Respect it," I said, "or stay away." Diane inhaled like a diver and began to apologize in a tone edged with choreography. The "I'm sorry" was there, but it was immediately followed by, "If only you'd warned us, and you know how people talk and we had to manage optics," as if remorse were a budgeting exercise and I had overspent on honesty. I held up a hand, not to scold, but to pause the script. "Stop it, I'm sorry," I said gently. "It's enough. I won't rewrite what happened to make anyone comfortable, and I won't carry your shame to keep the neighborhood calm." She met my eyes then, startled by the softness of my refusal, and let the rest of the sentences fall apart between us like props at the end of a play. Opal leaned forward and covered my hand with both of hers, the way she used to steady a mixing bowl when I stirred too fast. "You built a table," she whispered, "and left room for others to eat." I laughed, a small, grateful sound that didn't pretend the past had sweetened. "I built a table," I agreed, and I finally sat at it. For a few breaths we existed in that possibility. Diane learning to speak without the echo of strangers' opinions. Opal deciding that propriety could bow to compassion, me choosing to protect a quiet that had never been offered. The refrigerator hummed its practical hymn from the kitchen, and somewhere down the hall a floorboard answered, familiar and unafraid. A knock broke the shell of the moment. The figure on the porch wore a courier's satchel and the apologetic expression of someone who makes a living delivering disruptions. "Are you Sloane?" he asked, checking the name twice before handing over a stiff envelope banded with a colored tab. The return address belonged to a law office I didn't recognize, but the subject line through the windowed pane was clear enough to tilt the room. "Demand for return of heirlooms. Client Bianca." I signed, thanked him, and closed the door gently. Not because anything was fragile, but because I was deciding what would break me and what would simply be work. The morning of the hearing, Yara slid a slim binder toward me and tapped its spine like a conductor calling an orchestra to tempo. "Facts, timelines, photos, receipts," she said, her voice free of pep talk and pity. She'd rehearsed me the night before until my answers felt like muscle memory. What was purchased when, what was agreed to by whom, what the documents say versus what anyone wished they said. We practiced pauses long enough to let the record breathe and cut adjectives the way a tailor cuts excess fabric. "No theater," Yara reminded me. "Just the truth that fits." I nodded and left my emotions in the car with the coffee cup. Inside the courtroom, the air wore that bureaucratic chill that levels everyone. Bianca sat at counsel table in a blazer that looked borrowed, chin tilted toward a camera that wasn't there. Her attorney began with a story braided from grievance and glitter, claiming I coerced a sale through familial leverage and stole heirlooms during a chaotic transition. I let the words pass through me like elevator music. When it was our turn, Yara rose, unbuttoned her jacket with unhurried fingers, and placed the signed agreement exactly where the judge's eye would land. "Your Honor," she began, "we'll stick to documents. We built our case the way a house is framed. Straight lines, measured distances, joints that meet without noise." Yara offered the mediation agreement with Kiana's notes attached, showing the move-out terms, the damage offsets, and the mutual non-harassment clause both sides initialed. She followed with Celine's damage reports, time-stamped, photos of the cabinet face, the hallway scrape, the weeping P-trap, all cross-referenced to line items on the offset ledger I had kept with boring precision. She tendered emails that confirmed the adjusted cash for keys amount and receipts proving payment. "No self-help," Yara said. "No surprises, only process." The judge flipped through the binder, eyes narrowing at the neatness, then widened at the text messages Bianca had sent to a friend. A boast about taking what's owed, a selfie with a jewelry case half in frame, and a string of laughing emojis that aged poorly under fluorescent lights. Yara's tone stayed clinical. "These are petitioner's own words, Your Honor." Opposing counsel objected on relevance, then withdrew when the judge raised an eyebrow that seemed to have seen every chapter of this story in other families. The gavel didn't move, but something in the room's balance did. When the judge spoke, the cadence was administrative, not dramatic. The claims lacked evidentiary support. The agreement was clear. The offsets were well documented. The court would not entertain revisions based on retroactive regret. He warned Bianca's side that sanctions might follow if meritless filings continued. The word sanctions landed like a door clicking shut at the end of visiting hours. Yara thanked the court, sat, and handed me a pen to stop the tremor in my hand from becoming a sentence of its own. I breathed and realized I hadn't since the clerk called the case. Outside, the wind toyed with paper as lawyers drifted toward elevators. Bianca closed the distance between us, hissed that I had made them look poor, like reputation were a crystal vase I had pushed off a mantle. I met her eyes and kept my voice even. "Poverty isn't shame," I said. "Cruelty is." For a second, I saw the child she had been, trying on meanness the way other kids tried on costumes. She scoffed, spun toward the parking garage, and left a perfume, a trail that couldn't cover the sour of defeat. I didn't feel triumphant, just lighter, like a backpack finally set down. In the quiet after, Quinn called to say the refinance had funded. Her voice carried the click of completed math. Lean numbers. Yes. But sturdy rate locked, reserves intact. Payments mapped to nonprofit rent with room for repairs and a little breathing. I sat in my car and watched a cloud move across the courthouse facade, thinking about scaffolding you don't see once a building stands. Back at the house, an envelope waited handwritten, careful. The first residents had tucked a thank you note inside. A simple paragraph about warm lamps, quiet corners, and the relief of a door that shuts and opens without drama. I framed it in the entryway where the azalea pot once hid the foreclosure notice, a before and after only I needed to understand. On move-in week, the sky went the color of old pewter and the forecast turned mean. By evening, the storm had shouldered me into the grid. Lights snapped off house by house down the block until darkness held the street like a single breath. My phone vibrated with Aisha's alert. Power out, temperature dropping, pipes at risk, schedule tight. I grabbed my binder, my flashlight, and the keys that always felt warm, and stepped into a night that demanded every ounce of calm I had learned to earn. Rain needled the windshield as I tossed 2 flashlights, a pack of batteries, and a roll of contractor bags onto the passenger seat, called Sloane on speaker, and eased the hatchback into water that licked the curb like a warning. The city was a smear of brake lights and wavering reflections. Power had blinked out on the block, and the house sat inside that darkness like a held breath. Celine's voice came crisp through static. She was already 10 minutes away with a voltage tester and towels. I gripped the wheel and repeated the quiet mantra I'd built for emergencies. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. This was not heroics. This was stewardship. I had signed for responsibility, and responsibility had teeth that asked to be fed. We arrived within a minute of each other, headlights slicing across the porch, where the new fixture glowed uselessly, dead with the rest of the line. The air had the cold, metallic scent of a storm that meant it. Inside, the backup key turned, and the door surrendered with a soft, damp sigh. Celine moved through the hallway like a measuring tape come to life, touching each shutoff valve with the reverence of a ritual main water closed, then branch lines, then faucets open to bleed pressure. I laid towels like runway lights and set battery lanterns on counters so shadows stopped pretending to be problems. We checked the attic for leaks, the cellar for rising damp, and the kitchen for the treacherous weep of that once troublesome P-trap it held. Temporary heaters hummed where outlets fed the emergency circuit from a small, safe generator outside, cords taped down, windows cracked, the rules observed like vows. Aisha arrived with volunteers who would soon be residents, their jackets spattered with rain, faces open in that particular way people wear when they are both nervous and determined. They did not ask where to stand. They asked what to do. We moved in choreography that felt older than our acquaintance. Mopping, ringing, labeling buckets, sliding towels beneath sills, trading tools without speeches. One woman named Maribel checked every window latch with the concentration of a surgeon. Another, Raina, inventoried light sources and matched them to rooms like she was playing chess against the dark. Watching them, I felt something rearrange in my chest, like furniture finally placed where walking made sense. This, I thought, is my family now chosen, resilient, generous, uninterested in pity, fluent in solutions. My phone buzzed in my back pocket, a small, insistent heartbeat. Diane's text landed without preface. "Do you need help?" I stared at the question, tasting the past and the storm and the lemon glaze of the cake she'd refused, and typed back the most adult word I own. Yes. Bring thermoses, towels, and patience. No photos. No commentary. She replied with a single dot, then the three that mean incoming. 10 minutes later, she arrived awkward and earnest, bearing a bag of clean linens and 2 thermoses that steamed like apologies that had learned manners. Opal followed, a quilt folded in her arms and a look that asked for assignments instead of absolution. I pointed to the hallway and pressed towels into their hands. We worked side by side, not as mother and daughter, not as penitents and judge, but as people who understood the job. The storm pushed and rattled, then exhaled. Outside, the street transformed from mirror to slick ribbon. Inside, the house held. Our triage had worked no burst pipes, only the ordinary annoyances of a building that had been asked to endure a little more than usual. We gathered in the living room where lantern light gilded the edges of Camila's rugs, and every face wore the same tired, satisfied expression of people who had done exactly enough. In the quiet, I turned to Diane and spoke softly. Because triumph tends to break what it touches. I accept progress, not perfection. If you show up like this, hands first, mouth second, you can be part of this place. She nodded once, eyes wet in a way that didn't require applause, and said the 2 words I had waited half my life to hear without an aftertaste of explanation. I'm sorry. We made a small ceremony of boundaries, because boundaries deserve ceremony. Visits by invite. Respect for tenants, no gossip, no drop-ins, no circling the block to check on the vibe. No posts, no hints, no vague booking. If you forget, you'll be asked to leave. Opal patted my hand like punctuation and said she'd follow my lead. Diane repeated each rule as if learning a new instrument. The phrases a little stiff, but sincere enough to hold. Aisha smiled, a witness with a clipboard, and the volunteers tucked quilts over chairbacks like the house had been saving those spots for them. Outside, the last band of rain unspooled into mist, and somewhere a transformer thumped back to life, sending a hum through the walls that sounded like relief discovering its name. After everyone left, I walked the perimeter one more time, checking the generator, tightening a strip of tape, listening to the gutters negotiate with the night. My shoulders ached with the good weight of finished tasks. I stood on the porch, phone in my palm, a puddle painting my reflection into a taller person than I remembered being. The screen lit with an unfamiliar number and a message that read like a dare painted in gloss. Sloane, I'm Delaney. I buy stabilized properties. I can wire an eye-popping number to take this off your hands fast, clean, no contingencies. Interested? Delaney's message glittered on my screen like a storefront I could walk into and abandon in the same breath. A number large enough to rinse the past, a promise of speed, a swaggering list of reasons I should congratulate myself and cash out. I forwarded it to Quinn, then to Yara, then printed it and laid it on the kitchen counter where decisions sat taller than plates. The figure dazzled, yes. My pulse kept time with the zeros. But I ran the math against mission and stability because I had learned to measure more than the rush of now. Refi terms steady, reserves healthy, repairs predictable, tenant support strong. Delaney's windfall beat my spreadsheet only if I pretended life wasn't long. Aisha arrived with quiet eyes and a calendar crowded with arrows. They're interviewing next week, she said, smoothing the page where names and slots waited for outcomes. She didn't plead, exactly. She let the details speak. Maribel had a transit map folded into a star. Raina had printed a resume on good paper and practiced answers in the mirror until her throat softened. Another resident, Joy, had picked up an extra shift, knowing stability costs both time and tenderness. If you sell, Aisha added, careful as a seamstress, we'll start again. We always start again. But continuity is oxygen. The word oxygen reminded me that houses can revive or smother, depending on who turns the valve. I remembered rain needling my windshield, boxes bleeding ink, the azalea pot hiding a notice with its mouth full of dirt. I remembered the way my hands shook on Priya's laminate table, and the heat of keys dropped into my palm like a small animal deciding to live. I remembered the sentence that tried to fold me smaller. We can't pretend you're one of us, and the vow I made to own what they worshipped, not marble or gossip, but steadiness. Delaney's offer sparkled like a trick light. The rooms around me held a quieter brightness that didn't flicker when the door closed. I wrote my reply without drama. Thank you. But no. I choose consistent, dignified income and community impact. I hit send, felt the echo settle, and noticed I was breathing the way people breathe when they aren't bracing. Then I planned a small porch gathering on a Saturday that smelled like cut grass and good endings. Aisha brought lemon balm and a list of maintenance requests so short it felt like a compliment. Priya arrived with paper lanterns and the laugh that had ferried me across worse water. Celine leaned on the railing, cat-like, pretending she didn't love the compliment Camila gave her about the clean miter on the quarter round. Yara set down a pie and 3 documents labeled Future Boring, which is how she names protections that stop chaos before it wakes. Quinn came last, hugged me with exactly 1 arm, and said the numbers looked like sleep I could count on. Noor dropped off a folding table and a stack of mismatched plates, all of which seemed to have hosted better stories than ours until ours. Improved. Camila fussed with a runner. Zara tested the light and smiled when it behaved. We didn't give speeches. We clinked cups and let relief seat itself without name cards. Opal sat wrapped in a quilt, small and sovereign, cheeks bright with porch sun. Diane carried a lemon cake mine, copied respectfully, not stolen, and this time we ate it. The glaze caught light without performing, and when she handed me the first slice, there was no lecture folded between layers. I told them what I had told myself in the long blue hours, that once I wanted revenge loud enough to hear from the street, but what I wanted more was a life that couldn't be taken by anyone's opinion. A livelihood that didn't bow to optics, a home designed for usefulness rather than applause. Opal whispered, "You built that." And for once I didn't look away from the compliment. Zara's camera panned through rooms filled with quiet, useful hope lamps that clicked on without protest, rugs that forgave, shoes, a kitchen drawer stocked with measuring cups so dinner didn't depend on guesswork. The lens lingered on the framed note from the first residence, on the labeled breaker box, on a welcome basket that looked used rather than curated. It wasn't a montage of triumph. It was a tour of functioning mercy. Outside, children from the block traced scooter lines along the sidewalk. Inside, the refrigerator kept humming its little hymn. At dusk, I locked up, keys warm in my palm, and stood at the edge of the porch where the magnolia had learned my name again. I felt the house let me go without pushing me away, the way healthy things do when you stop clutching. I looked at the windows, the mended seams, the place where the azalea had once hidden bad news and now hid exactly nothing. The future did not appear with fireworks. It settled beside me like a companion I'd finally learned to trust. For the record, here's the last line I say over the closing shot, voice even, not grand. They taught me that belonging could be revoked. I taught myself that home is what I build and who I protect. The story doesn't slam a door or raise a glass too high. It resolves where it should, stability intact, boundaries honored, and a future I choose. Walking with me to the gate and onward. I locked the door at dusk with the keys warm in my palm and understood. I didn't just own their house, I owned my story. I chose steady purpose over loud revenge. A home that holds people up instead of a trophy that gathers dust. The past didn't disappear, but it stopped deciding my next step. Boundaries replaced apologies. My family can visit, my tenants can rest, and I can finally breathe without asking permission. If belonging can be revoked, then I'll keep building places where it can be rebuilt quietly, and on my terms. If this story made you pause and rethink what home really means, help me keep sharing honest journeys like this. Your small support quietly builds a bigger table for all our voices. Pass this along to someone who needs a steady reminder that dignity can be rebuilt. Stick around, there's more to learn, and the next chapter might be the one you've been waiting for. In Sloane's place, would you take the quick payout and walk away? Or choose slower, steadier dignity and keep the house and what would be your very first step?